Why don't we commence the second panel discussion of the day, which is on national data governance. I hope you've enjoyed our first two sessions so far. So let me just also underscore that one thing we have done is to invite one or two or others, if interested, members of each discussion to write a background concept note to stimulate our collective thinking. And you just heard reference to the excellent note that was written by Sir David Omand. And for this session, we have an outstanding concept note that has been written by Professor Chander as well. So I invite you to take a look at it, because not only are we trying to map the problems and the opportunities, but also think ahead to solutions and policy approaches that could make a difference to these problems and challenges over time. And as we turn now to the question of national approaches or data governance in a global economy, we have a fantastic group of experts with us. Let me just briefly describe them. I think you have their bios. We have, to my immediate left, Usman Ahmed, who's the head of global public policy at PayPal. But that is not the capacity in which he's here today. He is also an adjunct professor at Georgetown University Law School, and he teaches on international law and policy issues related to the internet. But I suspect by virtue of his commercial life, he has seen other things than that which only he sees from the academy. So we have that blended expertise, although speaking in an individual capacity today. Anupam Chander is a professor at UC Davis Law School and director of the California International Law Center. He's been a visiting professor at Yale, at Chicago, Stanford, and Cornell, and is the author of a fabulous book called The Electronic Silk Road, among others. So I thank you very much for flying in to be with us today. To my immediate right is Gordon Goldstein, who's managing director of Silver Lake Partners, which he joined in 2010 and is responsible for global external affairs, including government relations, public policy, strategic communications, and media, and is also a member of the UN Government and Industry Delegation since in 2012 to the World Conference on International Telecommunications. Perhaps most importantly, he's a member of our advisory committee at SIPA. As you heard earlier, has been a fantastic partner to us in thinking about our technology and policy initiative going forward. Mark Wu is an assistant professor at Harvard Law School, where he teaches on international trade and international economic law. But he comes to his position as a law professor after considerable experience working on cross-border trade and economic issues, both at USTR, where I believe he was responsible and indeed a lead negotiator on IP negotiations in several free trade agreements, and also earlier in his life at McKinsey, and I think even the World Bank for a period of years as well. So we have an extraordinary group of experts here today. And I think rather than just having each make initial interventions, I'd like to perhaps group our conversation in a couple of areas and then see where our conversation might take us. I mean, first of all, is thinking about what is the digital economy and how important are global flows of data for national and global economic well-being. Later in the day, we'll look at some areas that are being transformed by data, but this one, I think, is just to gather some broader perspectives on how we think about the digital economy and global data flows. And I think, Usman, you were going to have a lot of experience and perspective around that. Could I invite you to start us off?
Sure. And thank you again for the opportunity to speak at this august event. I was here last year and had the opportunity to participate, and now again this year. It's wonderful to see it continue to grow. So on your question of the impact of the digital economy, I want to point out two impacts. One kind of longitudinally and one let's say, vertically. So longitudinally, I think the interesting part of the impact of the internet has been how it has impacted nearly every sector of the economy. So if you think back to the initial days of the commercial internet, you had companies like Yahoo, eBay, you had the Apple iTunes Store. These were areas like retail, information, and IP goods, books, music, movies, that were traditionally not very regulated and very easy to see how and why they were digitized and were impacted by the internet. In the last few years, you've seen traditionally more regulated sectors, financial services, transportation with Uber. You're seeing lodging with Airbnb. These sectors of the economy now are being transformed due to the internet, and you're starting to see a lot of regulatory pushback in these areas. And then on the cusp, we're really on the cusp of kind of that continued proliferation. We had a discussion earlier today about healthcare and the internet and the impacts that that will have, a highly regulated area. Professional services, accounting, legal services, medical services that Anupam has written quite a bit about. These are being transformed by the internet. And that's where I think the regulatory challenges on a global scale, when you can offer a medical service to another country without ever having set foot in that country, without being subjected to the licensing requirements of that country, there's a whole host of new issues that will come from that. And the second kind of way to view how the internet has impacted the economy is not only across every sector, but from top to bottom. So traditionally, there's been some great research on technological diffusion done by Professor Komen at Dartmouth, where he looked at how technologies have diffused across countries. And it's often, obviously, the larger businesses and the larger members of the economy that secure the value from technological innovation. But what's interesting about the internet is that the smaller players, the individuals, the developers, the app developers, the small businesses, they are also kind of benefiting tremendously from this revolution, where you can be a small app developer in Latvia and you can develop a product or an app or a game or a service that anybody around the world can now take advantage of and use. And that's something that's fundamentally different, I think, about the way the internet has impacted the economy.
Mm-hmm. Other colleagues care to further comment on the economic characteristics?
Sure. So first I want to thank Dean Janow. I like to think of Dean Janow working with Professor Donardis as kind of creating the internet's think tank. And I think this is what they've done over the last few years. So thank you very much. So I just want to quickly mention a dozen technologies and innovations that depend upon kind of global data flows. So think about the Internet of Things, which has data flowing across countries at all times, the app economy, which creates lots of, the person that Usman mentioned, writing software in Eastern Europe and having it downloaded across the world, outsourcing of services, e-commerce generally, the kind that PayPal and eBay have long powered, cloud computing, big data, which relies upon gathering huge amounts of data across typically many countries, digital streaming, social media enterprises, the sharing economy, crowdfunding, where you can raise funds from an idea from across the world and build the future. And even more recently, concepts like servicification, which is the kind of disassembling of manufacturing processes into the various component services, and even augmented reality VR, which is coming online as of this year. So all these technologies depend upon global flows. And so I think the open internet has really powered an immense wave of economic progress that is the kind of foundation for the technological growth of this new century.
Well, thank you very much. Let's turn now to thinking about the regulation of data, both nationally and internationally. And there are many areas of economic life where it's very difficult to form international frameworks while domestic frameworks are in flux. And then there are some circumstances, I think, for countries where they use international frameworks to help drive a direction of domestic reform, because there can be best practices that are developed internationally, or that seems to be the direction of change, and it helps to in the evolution of domestic frameworks. So this relationship between the domestic and the international is a very complex one, I think we've seen. And more resistance, I think, is erupting in the world around international frameworks, I would say, in this moment we're in, although it has not always been so. So I know that everyone here has been very, very deeply involved in thinking about the international frameworks. Maybe we'll start with the international and turn to the domestic as well. Where do we see the international frameworks governing data currently as standing? In other words, we know that they're incomplete. There are parts of engagement at the WTO and bilateral frameworks, et cetera. I wonder if I could invite Gordon perhaps to offer a comment, and Mark as well.
Let me allow Mark to go first. And I'd like to address one of the specific problems. Why don't you begin with a broader tour of the horizon?
Sure. I just want to also extend my thanks to Dean Janow and to everyone here. I wasn't able to make this conference last year, and it was a real shame. And so I'm very glad to be here this morning. I think what's difficult about this space and understanding the international landscape is it's very much fragmented. And the way I like to think about it is, in some ways, there are three different layers. There is the national layer, which I understand we'll discuss in 1 minute. But at the international level, I think we can think of this in two different ways. One is there is the traditional state-led national sovereign agreements, government-led agreements between different governments. These can take on two different forms. One are these multilateral treaties, which were not crafted with data in mind, but who are now need to be reinterpreted with data flows in question. So an example of this is the WTO agreements. Those agreements cover both goods as well as services. There's nothing particular that defines data, but there are certain commitments between countries in terms of the provision of services across two countries, be these legal services, data processing services, financial services, and so forth. Data is a key component of that, and so there's a need now to interpret these agreements vis-a-vis those types of commitments I've made to these services, and we can go into some of the technical details as to why that's incomplete. There's also bilateral agreements between different countries governing the flow of data between those countries. The quintessential one that I think everyone here has focused on is that within the EU, and also with the EU and a number of other safe harbor countries. So that's a second example of, again, a government-led process. But the other I want to draw attention to is that which is happening between stakeholders, and particularly in the internet domain, between service providers and other types of critical internet infrastructure companies, as well as telecommunication standards, and so on and so forth. This is either a private-led or a private-public types of internet standards that are being formed, and we can think of these as soft law, not necessarily treaty, but they certainly are taking effect at the international level and help set the rules for the playing field.
Thank you. Gordon, would you like to speak on this, or should I invite other colleagues to speak first on other dimensions?
Well, I would just like to focus on one specific point of interpenetration between national and international regulation, and it relates to this theme of fragmentation. It was just noted that we have a fragmented system of regulatory oversight. We are increasingly observing a fragmented internet itself, and this is a theme that I've addressed in some of my research. I wrote a magazine article a couple of years ago called "The End of the Internet?" And as part of my research, I was directed to the scholarship that Anupam had done, an extraordinary survey of all of the different modalities of data localization, or data nationalism, as it's sometimes referred to, across the world. And I was astounded by his empirical recitation of just how broadly this is now being applied and what complexity it's introducing into how industry is operating in these different countries. This process of this web of data localization requirements across the globe was accelerated dramatically following the Snowden revelations at great potential cost to the global technology industry generally, but particularly American cloud companies. My colleague Dan Castro at the ITIF Foundation in Washington estimated that it'll cost American cloud companies something like $180 billion over the coming decade. And it is not generated by any of the ostensible purposes that are articulated. It provides no economic benefit domestically, except it challenges the primacy of incumbents. It provides no particular security benefits. One of the ironies is that Edward Snowden himself said that data localization actually was a far more insecure way to store data. And the point has been made again and again, it is not where data is physically stored, it's the technological mechanisms that protect the data. What data localization does provide, however, is the opportunity for some state actors to more readily get access to that data from the entity that controls it. And thus, as recently as this morning, I read in my morning news clips that the Home Minister in India is going to initiate a process by which they will seek to require Twitter and Facebook to store data locally in India. And the Home Minister was quite explicit in acknowledging the purpose. It was not for security. It was not for economic advantage. It was to more readily get access to the data of citizens who live in India, because the process of extracting that data from foreign internet service providers, social media companies, and other internet players is cumbersome and protracted. I'm quite alarmed by the scope of the problem. I'm alarmed by how it is accelerating, and I'm alarmed by the very strong incentives different countries are going to have to continue it.
Well, thank you. Let me invite Professor Chander to give us a sense. So you've done this, fantastic mapping of this landscape. What do you see as the principal drivers? And do you see this as accelerating, or is this just kind of jurisdictions waking up and kind of joining established norms? Or how do you evaluate what has happened and where we're headed?
So I think the principal driver depends upon the particular country that you're discussing. So in countries like India, I think it's very much the desire to control what the information landscape within the country looks like. And this is, the government would explain it because of fears of threats or violence that they are trying to manage. And so in other countries, it would be concerns about foreign surveillance. And so stopping information from going abroad, say to the United States, because it might be hoovered up by American spies. Of course, by the way, I should point out that American spies are good at operating overseas, and largely the foreign intelligence operations are directed towards overseas operations, so I'm not sure that it's very good at that. So I wholeheartedly endorse Gordon's observations that the efforts of data localization have not been particularly good with respect to the stated goals, those primary engines. A third primary engine is kind of stimulating local economic development by pushing out foreign service providers. What that does, however, is shoot oneself in the foot. It's a kind of a friendly fire on economic development, as one of my colleagues in Europe has described it, because what it does is it means that you can't build your companies on global data services. You have to pay for very expensive local infrastructures that can often be less secure than global infrastructures, that globally competitive infrastructures. And as Gordon rightly pointed out, security is not just a question of where something is put. Think of your money in your mattress at home, under your mattress at home. We know even though it's at home, it's not very safe. It's much more the process by which the security is managed. And so that really is a better way to look at security. So I think the motivations are economic, they are local law enforcement and fears of foreign surveillance. And I think they are being manifested more and more alarmingly across many liberal democratic states and more authoritarian states as well.
Let me invite you to answer the same question. Do you see the motivations similarly? And maybe to help us move into thinking about the consequences. I mean, if the consequences are inhibiting ease of doing business, you know, that's not the most compelling argument against a state.
That's exactly right.
So how do we think about the consequences?
Yeah, no, on your first point, if I'm in my academic capacity, so I can be a bit provocative. So the example of India. So somebody goes on a web platform, not necessarily Twitter, but let's just use Twitter as an example, and posts, you know, they're a Sikh person and they post that we want to kill Muslims, or they're a Muslim person and they post we want to, you know, and then 300 people are killed as a result of that, right? The Indian Home Minister or the Defense Minister has been put into office to try to stop that. And I think you're right that there's very legitimate criticisms of the methodology used for going after that problem. You know, localization may not be the most appropriate way to do that. It's probably not. But the issues that they're dealing with, there are certainly countries that don't have legitimate issues. But if we're using the example of India, you know, there are some really serious security, let's call them, concerns that the government has to deal with. And to your question, Janow, on the consequences, if the methodology used by the government is a hammer, is a butcher knife instead of a scalpel to deal with a very precise problem, then not only do you have the economic consequences to foreign businesses, which you rightly point out may not be so relevant to a foreign government, you also have speech issues, you have censorship issues that come to play, because the internet is kind of the communications tool, as was discussed earlier. You do potentially, based upon the methodology used, have technical issues. We've talked about, I love that term that Professor Denardis used, the infrastructure of everything. So you have potentially electrical power issues if if you have a foreign electrical power provider and you force them to locate domestically and they can't pull that off, you might have electricity issues. So there are all sorts of consequences that I don't think many of these governments think about when they're dealing with the problems, but I don't want to paint with a broad brush that all the problems that they're trying to deal with are not legitimate. There are some very legitimate issues that they are trying to deal with.
Mm-hmm. So if we're trying to create a better world, something that I think all of us are committed to doing, and we see this as an enormous problem central to the economic health of nations, but also to well-being broadly and safety, and we have to create better frameworks nationally and internationally. What's to be done? Are there any models? Where would we go? What needs to be done over the medium term? How do we sequence what needs to be done?
Please.
So I think everyone here will have important insights here. So I want to suggest a number of different areas in which we should be thinking. So just list a handful here. Surveillance reform. So we really need to make sure that governments will only let data flow across borders if they feel the data is safe across borders. And so surveillance reform has got to be a key to keeping the open internet. Similarly, governments will only let data flow across borders if consumer privacy is protected as data flows across borders. At the same time, we want to make sure that this doesn't become the realm of the new protectionism. So it's very easy to to say that to assert privacy or national security or law enforcement as a reason to stop essentially all foreign service providers in the future in the digital realm. right? Because we can't trust anything that happens overseas. And that's I think, something that for many of us in the trade community, we are especially concerned about, the possibility of a new era of privacy, of protectionism, not oriented towards goods per se, but now oriented towards the new tradable item, economic value, which is services. Cross-border access to data for governments has to be streamlined and made more effective. And I think, as Gordon and Usman have pointed out, the Indian government has been, like many governments, has been, like the US government in the Microsoft case, vis-a-vis Ireland, have been, a lot of governments have been concerned about their ability to access data stored abroad and not to utilize a kind of cumbersome MLAT regime that exists today. And finally, better dispute resolution so that individuals can be, can make claims across borders, can resolve issues. eBay and PayPal have rolled out the kind of models for this, I think, over the last decade. And so we need to have more such simple systems for global resolutions of personal disputes.
I think one of the organizing principles of the WTO and the GATT before it was instrument of negative integration. Instead of saying what governments must do, it was setting up rules on what governments could not do, should not do, could not discriminate, and so forth. And what we're seeing in some of the new frameworks, like TPP, is an effort to say, to move a little bit beyond that into more affirmative obligations about not introducing distortions or allowing data to flow and so forth, but not getting into the precise architecture of goods versus services and so forth. So I think everyone here has had a tremendous amount of experience around these frameworks. Is it a question of creating expanded multilateral prohibitions on conduct, or is it a question of defining more precisely more permissible forms and understanding more the nature of the digital economy, embodying that into international frameworks? Mark, would you like to?
Here's the tension as far as I see it. In theory, we should think of these data flows much like any other common space that's necessary for the transport of anything designed to foster economic activity. So in theory, we have the law of the sea to govern shipment. We have the Chicago Convention to govern things in the air and so forth. And in theory, we could have a multilateral convention to govern the flow of data. Here's the sticking point. I think if you think about what's different about data compared to some of these other conduits, the fear was simply of the economic protectionism element of if we closed the airspace or if we didn't allow for transport through our ports and so forth. But these other fears about security, surveillance, law enforcement were not anywhere close to as extensive, nor were these privacy concerns. And moreover, there's a real difference in view between the major trading powers today, between the US and Europe on one hand, where there are even differences between us, but never mind those differences then when you compare it with a China or India or Brazil. So I think the choice we have before us is as follows. We can create rules among subsets, but that will lead to the fragmentation problem that we all worry about. And so the TPP is a move in that direction, but it's unlikely a China or India or Brazil would ever join onto these type of TPP norms. Or we could have a real multilateral agreement that goes down to the lowest common denominator that these countries share between them and leaves a choice about how to interpret questions such as public morality issues, national security exceptions, and so forth to a set of jurists. And I see all of these major players as reluctant to do so, even though in theory that's possible. So I think we have this conundrum where we can lead to greater rulemaking but greater fragmentation, or one where we have thin multilateral rules that are left then up to jurists to decide, where the political economy in the US, Europe, China and elsewhere is not amenable to that type of agreement. And I think that's a difficulty we have before us.
Very well said.
I was gonna take a step up from the practical level of how we get better rules on this, and talk about a forum like this, where you have brought together folks who are in academia, but also in the private and public sector, who focus on computer science, technology, economics, foreign relations. These are going to be the first steps, I think, to bringing this together. Anupam, we've mentioned him like 7 times because he's the only guy who thinks about this stuff on a regular basis and is writing on this space. When we need an economist to, no offense, we need strong economists who are looking at the economic implications of a data localization requirement. We need a technical expert to describe how and why this fragments the internet and what it does to it. Like, these are conversations that are just beginning. And it's very difficult, again, sympathizing with a government. When a government is faced with a serious security threat or a privacy issue and doesn't have a wealth of information to pull on to say, here's the implications of what my decision will cause, it's hard to blame them for making poor decisions. And there's just not, I was, in my other capacity at a company, was facing this issue of, how do I talk to a government about a data localization measure? And I was looking towards academia and the environment to say, okay, here are very concrete things that happen, and here are concrete norms that you can look to. Here's the right solution. And there's still a lot of work to be done on those issues before we can come to multilateralizing and regionalizing. The TPP is the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and a trade agreement between 13 countries that are kind of like-minded on policy. It doesn't have, I think, the ideal rules from a lot of people's perspectives. So that's not necessarily the exact framework that somebody who was designing the internet from the start or designing a system for data localization from the start would utilize. So there's still a lot of work that needs to be done from an academic perspective.
Thank you very much. I completely have conviction around that, as you can see, and we I think are very pleased to be a forum that is attempting to bring diverse expertise together around this, given the nature of this problem. But I think it also speaks to the challenge, of course, governance of the internet itself has broke open, and this new vocabulary that's developed around multi-stakeholder engagement, which is very awkward and still evolving. And I know Gordon has been deeply involved in that thinking about it on a fairly discrete set of questions, but with very broad implications, how you think about advancing a multi-stakeholder model. Any thoughts you'd like to share around that?
Well, I think it's a tremendously important question, and it's related to the challenge of establishing a multilateral mechanism that would address global data flows. I must say that I am not sanguine that we will achieve success there because of the difficulty we've had in generating a global consensus on these issues related to internet governance. I see that my colleague Ambassador Sepulveda, who will be speaking at lunch, has just joined. We were both in Dubai in 2012 on the American delegation to the WICET, which was the first instance since 1988 when the global rules of international telecommunications would be negotiated. It was a treaty conference and very important. Well, without bringing you into the weeds, the takeaway was that that conference collapsed at the 11th hour around the issue of whether the internet would be subject to these regulations and whether international bodies like the United Nations or subsidiary organs of the UN, like the International Telecommunications Union, would play an important role on internet governance. The United States position was it should not. And we actually refused to sign that treaty on that basis, and the conference collapsed. 89 countries ultimately did sign the ITRs, as they are known, and 54 countries, led by the United States, chose not to. So I believe we are at a point where we have a very fragile consensus between these competing visions of the multilateral oversight of the internet and the multi-stakeholder model, which is the one that the United States has championed based on the notion that the internet should be governed by its core stakeholders, civil society, the technology community, business, and so forth. So I find myself in a much more modest cast of mind when I think of solutions. And my first solution would be simply first do no harm. There are very good intentioned policy initiatives that are being implemented in pernicious ways. And not to pick on India, but I think of the problems that Facebook has encountered in India in recent months. You'll be talking to Elliot Schrage tonight. Facebook has made it an institutional priority and a global goal to advance internet access, particularly in the development world. So they implemented their Free Basics program in India. This is a classic instance of the perfect being the enemy of the good, because it was interpreted that the Facebook Free Basics program was not fundamentally in a pure way consistent with absolute ideals of net neutrality. It was banned. Here was an instance when a major American internet company was engaging in a serious effort to advance economic development through expanding internet access, and it was castigated and shut down. And not just there, in Egypt, and it will confront the same problems in other areas. So I believe we are at a real point of tension, not just on the question of internet governance, but on the question of access and digital trade. And I think first we should do no harm and find a way to preserve the status quo to the greatest degree possible.
Well, thank you very much. With that, why don't I open it up and collect a couple of questions, comments from our audience. Sir, let's go in the far back to start. If you wouldn't mind introducing yourself.
Yeah. So thank you very much. I'm Ricardo Melendez-Ortiz from the ICTSD in Geneva, the International Center for Trade and Sustainable Development. So just to focus on the discussion on the panel right now, you seem to be saying that there's a problem with fragmentation of regulatory oversight, but at the same time that it is not ideal at this point to work with existing frameworks, multilateral or otherwise, particularly trade frameworks, to address that fragmentation. That seems to be the message coming out. We have the experiences with TPP, for instance, dealing with issues of forced localization, dealing with issues of transfers of source code as a condition for business. And in the WTO, you have also a few other rules that I think may be helpful in a way that is not just appealing to the good reasoning of national governments to apply domestic policies that would allow the continuous growth of the international applications, if you like, of the digital technology. So, is that the right interpretation? Am I interpreting right what is coming out from the panel? Let me let's stop there and maybe just disclose that, of course, I've been working with several of you and with many others on these issues, and what I'd like is to really provoke a clear reaction from you to the public. Thank you.
Well, just to be a little bit more transparent about your own contributions in this area, I mean, you've been leading a global effort to identify the evolution of the international trading system, including around digital trade, and have come up with, I don't know, you've managed 150 experts and at least 16 working groups. So I know that there are many concrete proposals that have been advanced, including, I think, by some people up here. So I don't think there's utter pessimism, but one must recognize that we're not in a period of expanding international frameworks, right? And so in that environment, you know, how far do the current frameworks take us? And are what we're talking about, you know, tweaks to maintain openness where we can, or something deeper? I think each would have a different response. Who would like to start?
Should we begin with Mark?
I'll start with just a quick comment. I think there's a difference in terms of thinking about the usefulness of multilateral frameworks with respect to digital trade. So I think there are positive things we can do at the multilateral level to advance the possibilities for increased digital trade and even digital interactions. An example is the de minimis threshold by which customs taxes are charged at the border with respect to e-commerce, for example. With respect to filling out of customs forms, making those available through a single window, for example. All of these help trade economic activity on the internet. But the question that we have before us on the panel is the one about data sovereignty and whether or not those same frameworks could be used to develop multilateral rules on data sovereignty and to tie countries' hands in terms of saying we will not do X or we will not do Y subject to these types of limitations. And on that particular question, I would say I am pessimistic. I think there's a lot that can be done at the multilateral level to push digital trade, but not per se to tackle the question of data localization.
Other perspectives?
Please, I'll go last.
So I would like to be an optimist, and I feel like I have to be an optimist because if we don't figure out a modus vivendi for having information flowing across borders, all the greatness of the internet kind of collapses. And so I think necessity will be the mother of invention here. And so the US and the European Union will come to an agreement because they have to. And I think what's happened thus far is that the global flows have continued across the Atlantic even without a legal regime, simply because they had to. So companies have kept on sending information, even though if you read the European Court of Justice opinion, it really puts into question any of the various systems for data sharing with the United States. And so the legal basis of that opinion would call into question all of that international data flow. And some of the data protection authorities within Europe have actually suggested as much, that there's no safe way to send information to the United States as it currently stands. Because of the necessity of that flow, I have to hope that governments between Europe and the United States, between Asia and the United States, and between Asia and Europe, and within Africa and Latin America, will have to come to a way to get along. Now, this may not be a formal agreement. This may well, I think a formal agreement may be very difficult, but it may simply be a kind of de facto toleration for information to flow.
I would say I'm optimistic on the principles, but I'm pessimistic on the reality. So I want to distinguish what the World Trade Organization would do with a digital trade agreement or digital economy agreement versus what was happening with the WISIT and the International Telecommunications Union. That debate was about fundamentally governing the technical architecture of the internet, giving purview to the ITU, to that set of issues. What I think the World Trade Organization has done since its inception and what its mandate is to review all sectors of the economy to ensure that regulations, domestic rules, tariff rules, different regulatory requirements are done in a least trade restrictive manner. And if that is the narrow purview with which this issue is discussed on a multilateral level at the World Trade Organization, then again, from a principles perspective, I'm optimistic. From a practicality of it being that narrow and of stakeholders who maybe don't value privacy as much or don't value security as much, wanting to chip away at that, or the vice versa, that is where I think there will be tremendous difficulty.
Thank you. Let me collect a couple more questions. There was one gentleman here that previously, so and then here, and then we'll let our panel respond.
Thanks. I'm Peter Misek from Access Now, and I lecture at SIPA. I wanted to, we've had a few mentions of India's regulation on zero rating and net neutrality, so I just wanted to raise that one with a little bit more context. And I just think it's really unfortunate to point to that as an example of, I don't know, localization or of poor internet policymaking. Looking at multi-stakeholderism, as a guide, that regulatory process was robust. It was open. It was, conducted over a few months. It wasn't a 2-week thing like we see in Myanmar. It was a process that I think should be upheld as a national model for local multi-stakeholder internet policy making. And the fact is, net neutrality was not on the books in India. That was a decision made that one single gatekeeper to restrict access to the internet. It's precisely because they want global universal access to the networks that we enjoy that they the regulator moved to protect Indian users. So, I think I'd like to hear a little bit about how this multi-stakeholder model can work at a local level. I think the CGI.br in Brazil is another example of that. And I also see room for net neutrality to actually preserve innovation and the local creation of content becoming the law of the land in the EU. It will be up to 47 nations around the world that have enacted net neutrality regulations, beginning with Chile. Slovenia was an early one. So this is definitely, I think, one example of the internet community coming to a rough consensus globally on a principle that protects users as well as innovation. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. Jay Healy, do you want to try to project?
Yes, thank you. Fascinating conversation so far. But a lot of this has been talking about steady state, about, as in a relative, when things are relatively quiet. And so I'm very curious, when we saw that in finance sector, how we looked at financial regulation and how you deal with finance sector in kind of peacetime is different from how you do crisis management. Now, finance sector had the Bank for International Settlements, and it's got central bank governors, it's got all sorts of cooperation. I'm very curious your thoughts. What do we do if an IT company that's too big to fail has a Lehman moment? Imagine one of the big cloud service providers. It's there with everyone's data on Friday, it's gone on Monday. So how do you imagine that your companies, or US or Indian or British or French companies, and those governments might come together in such a time of crisis? What mechanisms might we use? Is there something existing? Do we have to try and invent it during the crisis itself? Thank you.
Interesting. David Kirkpatrick.
I wanted to just quickly address the fundamental pessimism of the panel and ask a question about that, which was, had the Snowden incident not occurred and the U.S. not have been revealed to be treating its own national champion internet companies as a candy store and basically not operating by the rule of law and essentially freedom of speech that it claimed to adhere to, would we be having a fundamentally different discussion today about this? And do you think attitudes in places like India or even far worse, Turkey, et cetera, would be a little bit less problematic today, or would it have happened anyway?
Okay, thank you. Well, I think we'll invite every member of this panel to engage those questions they feel most affinity towards. I think the India question was surely directed your way.
Seems to be.
And so I'd like you to lead us off on that, but feel free to comment on others as well.
Sure. I appreciate the question's challenge to my characterization of what is occurring in India, but with all due respect, I just fundamentally disagree. 3 points. One, the process in India may have been robust, but a lengthy and robust process that comes out with the wrong outcome is not a good outcome. I think you have to delineate between process and policy, and I don't think the policy in India is one that serves the global ambitions for a free and open internet, and I'm not sure it serves the citizens of India itself. Two, to characterize Facebook as seeking to be a gatekeeper for internet access for that whole country, I think is an unfair characterization both the substance of their program and what their intention is. We will have Elliot Schrage here tonight. He can speak to that, but I think that's an unfair characterization of what is encompassed within Free Basics. And then third, I'll share my own view that the internationalization of net neutrality, to the degree that that is occurring, and it is, in a number of countries, in my view, is an unfortunate phenomenon. We had an equipoise here in the United States where the principles of net neutrality were widely adhered to by internet service providers and others without formal regulation. And the decision to reclassify the internet as a common carrier under 1930s depression law, to me, was an unnecessary intervention into an ecosystem that was functioning quite efficiently. I believe that decision is consistent with the general approach of net neutrality quite often being a solution in search of a problem, at least as it has existed in the United States. There was a terrific public policy outcome in 2010 when our former chairman of the FCC, Julius Janikowski, graduate of Columbia, worked with industry leaders to articulate a series of principles that all of the industry players around the table voluntarily agreed to adhere to, and they did. And there was no consistent pattern of discrimination or throttling that was shown to be inconsistent with the commitments these players made. Yet nonetheless, a decision was made to reclassify the internet. That is just one example of the potential unwanted and ironic consequences of seeking to keep the internet free and open.
Thank you. Mark, would you care to comment on one of these invitations?
I'll just comment very quickly on the question about the crisis moment. I think we're just at the cusp of seeing how much data is going to flow, and Anupam and others have touched on the Internet of Things and how that's going to revolutionize the way business and commerce is conducted. Usman can touch about how within emerging economies in the developing world, we're just at the cusp of this. So the nature of the crisis, I think, is still unclear as to when that moment's going to hit. But I do think when it's going to hit, it'll look much like what we've seen in other spaces, right? Large multinational players negotiating with governments, coming towards informal agreements, and then that forming the basis for what will eventually crystallize through national law and possibly to international agreements.
Thank you.
So on the first question, I just want to point out, if there was a multilateral trade framework related to the digital economy, a regulation like a requirement like India's net neutrality decision would be upheld, right? Because it was transparent. It was all the actors in the ecosystem were subject to the same rules. Nobody was barred market access for illegitimate reasons. So again, that's why principally I think I'm optimistic on the trade regime as providing rules in this space, but as I said, practically I think it'll be difficult. And the trade regime has exceptions for privacy and security and issues that are of significant regulatory concern. To the point on I like the moniker of too big to fail for data. So I don't think any government has thought about that. I think it's a fascinating issue, but I think the methods and the tools used would fit right into this discussion. It would be about, okay, these companies are getting too big. They're not located in my jurisdiction. What do I do? How do I control if my citizens' data, if all my citizens live on X platform and that platform's not in my country and that platform fails, what do I do? So I think it would be this exact discussion would play out on that issue. It would just be that I don't think that in realistic terms, governments are thinking about that right now. They're probably thinking more about people are, doing violence or criticizing people or whatever on these platforms. But it's a very interesting point. And lastly, on the Snowden, I don't think that these discussions would be especially. So we were here a year or two ago, and I remember it was all about Snowden. Yep. And now I don't hear that nearly as much both in domestic or international discussions, and the same issues continue to kind of shape the ecosystem, privacy, economic development. These are the issues that drive a lot of these discussions around localization, and I think they've been changed by Snowden, but I don't think they would be I still think these would be the fundamental issues even if Snowden didn't happen.
So let me address all three of the important questions. First, with respect to the question of net neutrality, I think it's important for internet activists to not see net neutrality as a sum total of internet values. And that, I think, sometimes happens. So that internet activism is generated around net neutrality and everything else is forgotten. And I think that's a danger. And so, for example, I would like to see, the Access Now focusing on the ability of people across the world to be able to provide services to the United States and Europe, right? That should be, I think, part of the economic development access agenda for the internet. That is one of the ways that the internet liberates the world. It brings economic development power to the world. And that would mean, for example, worrying about how the European Union operationalizes its data privacy regime, which effectively has the end result of barring providers from across the developing world unless they go through extremely expensive, extremely difficult processes for certification, et cetera. And so it's, as I like to quip, that it's, if you want to be declared adequate to be a member of the European Data Union, you're much better off applying to be a member of the European Union than you are seeking an adequacy ruling. You're far more likely to obtain if you look at the history of this, it's far more likely to use that as the way to become a member of the European data safe regime. Second, with respect to the digital Lehman Brothers collapse, I think that the way that the cloud is structured in these globally competitive companies is in fact very robust, exactly designed to build in redundancies that allow you to take down parts of the internet. The internet seeks censorship or failure and routes around it. That's the way these cloud services have been designed. In fact, data localization does the exact opposite, which is creates more likelihood of bringing infrastructure that fails in a particular crucial moment, bringing down the local internet generally. I was struck when I was doing my review for Indonesia that Indonesia said that data localization was helpful to prevent against natural disasters. And so Indonesia, a country that has suffered very significant natural disasters, would be one I would think that would want data to be stored across the world. Finally, the great question of whether Snowden's revelations have changed the kind of activism around data and the relationship of the surveillance state to the biggest corporations of the world. I think they have. But I think it's also important to recognize that the biggest corporations of the world have often been actually trying to contest efforts by states to yoke them into becoming vassals of the surveillance state. And that is, if you look back at efforts by Google and Yahoo to combat subpoenas going back more than a decade. If you could look back even to Yahoo fighting tooth and nail in France and in the United States against a very simple request from France to stop allowing for its citizens to access Nazi materials. Yahoo wasn't doing that because it liked Nazi materials by any stretch of the imagination. What Jerry Yang and the folks at Yahoo are doing was trying to ensure that the internet did not go from being the most free space in the world to being the most unfree space in the world, to being the most controlled. Because if France could control what happened on Yahoo, then so could every other country in the world, and the internet would become the kind of the smallest rump set of materials that you could possibly find, regulated by the strictest rules of all the countries of the world combined.
Well, thank you very much. I think we all know that law is a laggard. It's slow moving. You won't, but technology is driving these forces, and so is globalization. So when you put these factors together, they're far outpacing any regulatory framework, whether domestic or international. And I think that's what we are engaging here. I think the point that was just made and that's been made implicitly earlier is not one of national consensus. That is to say that data is safer in the cloud, okay. Now, I think most technologists would agree with that. But I don't think, I think there could be more discussion around that globally to see, is okay, national cloud versus international cloud, you know, how, where do those safety issues, how far do they extend with respect to distributed data and its consequences? Also understanding these global connections and the industrial internet. I think we've talked a lot about it implicitly, but there is a much more explicit conversation around the industrial internet that I think is not part of public full understanding, I would say. And so one can be quite an optimist, I would say, about the potential of data and its and technology and where it can drive us, and be quite cautious, I think, about the regulatory frameworks at the same time. And I share this view that Snowden revealed something that was understood by a few and made it understood by many, and sparked a conversation that was crucial around the world. But now we really are looking at more fundamental factors. So we've had a wonderful engagement on some dimensions of this, and so please join me in thanking our panel. And then, thank you, great discussion. Please help yourself to a lunchbox, which I hope will be good. And then we'll come back, have some time together, and then we have some remarkable luncheon speakers as well. Thank you. Thanks so much. It was great.